take this opportunity to acknowledge that the intellectual life of the Bard Graduate Center here on West 86th Street on the island of Manhattan unfolds on the ancestral homeland of the Lenni Lenape people. New York's intellectuals are famous, but the New York intellectual is not often an academic, though the New York intellectual might have the occasional academic appointment. But our speaker tonight is a genuine intellectual and a genuine academic. And for both these reasons, we are so pleased to welcome Richard Sennett to the Bard Graduate Center. He's University Professor of the Humanities at NYU and Professor of Sociology at the London School of Economics. He began his studies at the Juilliard School, playing the cello, and studied at the University of Chicago and has his PhD from Harvard. Over the course of the last 5 decades, and I'm probably telling you things that you know already, he has written about social life in cities, about changes in labor and social theory. His books include Families Against the City, The Hidden Injuries of Class, The Fall of Public Man, Authority, The Corrosion of Character, Respect, The Culture of the New Capitalism. Those are all separate books. And then a series of works related to the idea of Homo faber, man the maker. These include The Craftsman, 2008, Together, The Rituals, Pleasure, and Politics of Cooperation, 2013, and Building and Dwelling, Ethics for the City, 2018. But The Craftsman, published in 2008, probably is the book that the largest number of people in this room may be familiar with, and the one that touches most closely on the mission of this institution. It focuses on the basic human impulse, the desire to do a job well for its own sake. And although the word may suggest a way of life that waned with the advent of industrial society, Sennett argues that the craftsman's realm is far broader than skilled manual labor, that the computer programmer, the doctor, the parent, and the citizen also can function as a craftsperson. The past life of craft and craftsmen also suggests ways of using tools, of organizing work, and thinking about materials that remain alternative, viable proposals about how to conduct a life with skill. He's also had an extensive public career, first as the founder of the New York Institute for the Humanities, then as president of the American Council of Work. For the last 3 decades, he has served as a consultant to various bodies within the United Nations. Most recently, he wrote the mission statement for Habitat 3, the United Nations Environmental Congress. 5 years ago, he created Teatrum Mundi, a research foundation for urban culture, whose board of trustees he now chairs. His talk at the BGC tonight reflects this current work, connecting his longtime interest in cities with the big problem of tomorrow, our climate. And the title of his talk, climate, I'm thinking of the cold weather outside. The title of his talk tonight is The Next Frontier, Cities and Climate Change. Welcome, Richard Sennett.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much. I am glad to talk to you about, I should explain, I have worked for the UN off and on for decades. And when I retired from those 2 institutions 4 years ago, I thought that finally I would write a book on the performing arts, which I've always wanted to write, but that book got delayed because I unretired and became involved in a project on the relationship between cities and climate change. I know about cities. I still don't know as much as I should about climate change. But I thought I would just tell you a little about what we're doing at the UN. I'm speaking personally, not bureaucratically, on behalf of the UN. And actually, I think it might be of interest to you because of the material stuff that we're trying to engage. This is a project which is tries to really engage the physical and the social and cultural. And so basically, I'm not going to tell you how we're going to solve the climate problem because we don't know. But these are the issues that we're grappling with, are ways of thinking about how to get into this problem, the relation between the, if you like, the social and the material. So I'd love any feedback you can give me. I have to say I've spent 6 hours in sub-basement 2 of the UN today. I'm a little groggy, so I don't know how coherent I'll be, but we'll see. These are the 6 things I want to talk to you about. I want to talk to you about the so-called climate emergency. I want to just give you some info on the present condition, material condition of climate change. I want to tell you something that's far away from what you're thinking about, but very close to what we're thinking about, which is what to do with climate refugees, many millions of whom are headed towards cities. An issue that we're grappling with is, can you deal with climate change democratically, that is, from below in cities? So the 5th one, again, comes close to, I think, this question of the kind of materiality of dealing with the climate. And that is relation between adaptation and mitigation. And finally, I'd like to talk a little about cultural changes that are required to deal with this problem. So let me start about states of denial. This is for us a very critical issue. The kind of journalistic way of thinking about it is that if people really got the message about how dire climate was, that they do something about it. And that journalistic message is basically ridiculous because it assumes that the public is uninformed and that it's a matter of convincing people that things are dire by declaring a kind of crisis in climate. And what's ridiculous about it from kind of sociological point of view is that when people are faced with life-shattering problems, that often they go into a state of denial and about what they know is true, but they are denying to it. And there are kind of 2 models for this states of denial. One is something first developed by Hannah Arendt and then articulated by my friend Stanley Cohen, which is about not knowing and knowing at the same time, which is that the more a kind of cataclysmic set of evident facts is in front of you, the more that you retreat into denial. This is what Hannah Arendt was thinking about when she wrote Eichmann in Jerusalem. Do you know this book? It's about the Holocaust. Older people are probably know it. And she said, far from Germans not knowing about the concentration camps, they both knew and not knew. And the more that it was evident that something horrible was happening, that is, that Jews were disappearing from Eastern Europe, Poland as well as Germany, the more people went into denial. And Stanley Cohen articulated this in, he was South African, about the South African townships during the apartheid period, which was that the idea of apartheid is that whites should never know about how blacks lived and the horrible conditions under which they were living. And he said quite the contrary. The more they knew about it, the more they said they knew nothing. So that's one thesis about the states of denial. The other is a kind of Pavlovian thesis. Pavlov was a 19th century psychologist. He's the author of the famous experiments about starving dogs to get them to bark, which I won't go into. But he's also the author of something which is called The Rabbit and the Wolf, which is that when a rabbit sees that it's in the sights of a wolf, it plays dead. And we know that if you've been up to Bard College, the other Bard College. You know that about deer that get paralyzed in the headlights around them and suddenly freeze. And that's a notion that sort of you become totally passive when faced with a mortal threat, that the body literally shuts down. And this is why, for us, declarations of the language of climate emergencies is counterproductive, because it tends to be paralyzing to people. And one of the issues that we're dealing with is how to get people beyond this state of dwelling in a state of denial about this, which is probably the most life-threatening issue of our time. So that's the context in which we're working. We want people to act rather than to deny. And to do that, paradoxically, the language of terror and crisis has to be surmounted. Also has to do with Heidegger, too, who spoke the language of crisis and paralyzing. And that's for dinner. I thought I always do this when I talk about this subject, just to give you a sense of what we're facing. This is, as they say in academia, a robust and I would say rock solid picture of what the world's energy mix is going to look like in 16 years. We've been at this graph for an enormous amount of time. By the way, this is all for you if you want to. You have these on in your computers, so feel free to use them, download them, and so on. The thing about this graph, which is really quite amazing, is that if you look at renewables, they're only going to be 14%. As I said, this is not pie in the sky. It is a pie graph, which is absolutely, we've done a lot of technical work to produce this. Coal and oil, and to some extent natural gas, are the ways in which we're going to get our energy, and the natural gas a little less except from fracking. But coal and oil are deep pollutants. So what the reality we're looking at is that our bar is something like 1.5% rise in carbon emissions, and this is about 2.3. So that's why we're so exercised about this. Another way to just look at this is the contributors to global warming, and you can see that energy use, industry, and transport and agriculture are a really big part of this. Those are basics that are not easily changed by just saying do less. You know, it's hard to say about transport, as I'll show you later, that you can do much about the energy uses here. So that's another part of this. This gets closer to the things we're dealing with in the urban dimension, which is these are 30 hotspots where water is in danger. The thing about this is that those hotspots are the water tables for cities, even though they may not be in cities. The Amazon, for instance, is really the basic water table for parts of it for Sao Paulo. So if these fresh water things, even though they're not in cities, if they lower, the effect on cities is dire. Now, this is, I wish this clicker worked. What do I do?
Sorry.
Oops. Who knows? Well, it doesn't matter. this is something that should worry you in two ways. What you're seeing up in Russia with deforestation means that as tundra begins to as it deforests, there is a release of methane, and methane is about 30% more polluting in terms of global warming. It's about 3 times more polluting than CO2. So what you're looking up in the far right there is a huge source, as you have deforestation, of the release of a gas which is super controlled, and of course the Russians don't care. So that's going to happen. But I'd like you to look at the Canadian one over on this side. It's not quite as bad, but still there you're having tundra loss. And with tundra loss, you're getting a different kind of gaseous formation that's released. So again, when we're talking about climate change, climate warming, it's actually under these Arctic conditions where very sensitive things happen. I don't want to say anything about Brazil because you probably read about that in papers, but you can see the red is the most serious here. And that's what's happening in this deforestation of Brazil. And for us, of course, this is out of our control because the president of Brazil, Bolsonaro, doesn't believe in climate change. So this is, well, I don't want to say anything more about that. I thought this might be interesting to you. I flipped these slides in just about what climate rises will feel like. New York City is going to feel like the depths of the South if current emissions continue. You can see that there is basically will become a tropical country. That's what that looks like. But there's a caution about this, which is a technicality of which I'll get to in a second. This is what the climate will look like for most of the globe between June and August if these present trends continue. That means that for a good part of the globe, the summer will become an uninhabitable time outdoors. It's a huge 40 degrees outdoors which is what we're looking at, is intolerably hot. And it has all kinds of knock-on effects for thinking about cities because they'll have to be super air-conditioned. But one thing I wanted to show you about this, which is not intuitively obvious, is that once you get over a certain level of climate change, you get what are called path-dependent things. That means that variables begin to interact within each other, which means that simply going the farther north you go, the more insulated you are from climate change. That's no longer true. That's a linear notion. Here you can see that up in Minnesota or in Maine, that those are hotspots that will develop. And I flipped in one, we don't like to do this, but if you look here, you can see how New York, of course, will become nearly uninhabitable in the summer. But look up there in Maine. It's a confluence of air currents, proximity to the Great Lakes, the Gulf Stream, all of that, which means that the flight north is not an answer to this problem because you get these path-dependent irregularities. I wanted to try and calculate Bard College, and I don't have any precise numbers for it, but you can see that up the Hudson, which is shown up there, is going to be super hot. So maybe there will be no more Bard festivals because it will have to have super air conditioning. Anyhow, that's not your problem. Now I want to show you something about flooding because that impacts on cities. And that is that this is a thing that the places that basically what this is the places, the cities most threatened by flooding are coastal cities in the developing world, plus New York City and LA. So maybe Rio. I'm still not convinced about that. But so here and LA are going to be in the situation of Mumbai, probably of Singapore, and so on. So their populations are growing in the third world, and also their risk is growing at the same time their population is growing. These slides are, I live in Britain, I guess. I don't know, I'm on a plane so often these days, I don't believe it. This is what flooding looks like in Britain. The blue is likely to be flooded. And here's the only happy slide I'm going to show you. This is what will happen to the Houses of Parliament after 4 degrees of global warming. Now, my fantasy about this is that all the MPs will get into canoes to conduct business, since they won't be able to do it inside, and that many of these MPs are so grossly overweight that the canoes will capsize. And that will be the end of that. Anyhow, so that's that. Now, the third thing I wanted to talk to you about is climate refugees. And climate refugees are, and here's where we get into sort of material culture. Most climate refugees are going to appear in the world as a result of desertification, that is, of drought. And I'm going to show you what that looks like in Africa, where I'm doing a lot of work. These are, in general, a map of people who are being displaced by natural hazards in Africa. That includes flooding, desertification, and temperature. But if you drill down a little more into a country like Somalia, you can see on the right, if you look at that, the drought is the principal cause of displacement. It's much more than civil war. Somalia, terribly, terribly violent place, but much more than the civil war that is driving people is drought. I'll show you what. On the other side is what we have to deal with, which are priority needs within the first 36 hours, 48 hours of people who are displaced. Let me show you what drought looks like. Here's a well. I'm sorry for my photo. Here's a well that's run dry in Somalia. These are people looking down it. Here's what that same well looks if you look down it. Originally, the well was just you see where the squared off parts of it were, it was all the way up there. And this is what desertification looks like if you turn away from the well in Somalia. That's the material condition which is driving people to abandon this stretch of Africa. And here you can see what our projection is about this desertification that will occur by 2060 if the climate continues as it is. The spots are cities, as in Mali, Bamako, whose water tables will shrink because of the desertification of the desert. Remember, I showed you that earlier slide of desertification in the U.S. Well, this is that multiplied. Multiplied because our estimate is that what you're looking at here is between 65 and 85 million people who will have to flee, for whom this is not a sustainable way of life. And most of the places that they're going to try to flee to are in Turkey, Iran, or Europe. Now, I don't know how cognizant any of you were about what happened in Europe when we had 1.5 million refugees from Syria who suddenly flowed into Europe in 2015. It provoked a huge outpouring of right-wing sentiment. So that was 1.5 million. And now, say, conservatively, if 40 million want to come to Europe, the political consequences of this are enormous. I didn't put in here the slides about desertification in Mexico and in, but it's the same problem. And no wall, no matter how much this crazy president of yours, how high that wall is, stops people whose alternative is either to die of thirst or to migrate. It's not an option, you know? So the problem for us is, and I should say one thing about desertification and attempts to build walls. This is in the Sinai. No, it's not in the Sinai, it's in the West Bank, sorry. And it's a kind of Berber settlement to the south and an Israeli settlement to the north. And in a way, it's the picture of an illusion. Israelis, they're wonderful water managers. They're phenomenal water managers in the desert. My Israeli colleagues are, I would say, geniuses at making the desert bloom. But what's happening here is by putting up the fence, these Berber-like settlements to the south are doing nothing. There's no interaction between the two. And the water table doesn't know, it knows nothing about security fences. So the disaster happening to the south here is ultimately going to undo the kind of genius of planting that's done in the Israeli settlements. And I show this to you because that's an issue also for you in America. That the fact that you are spending, I don't know how many billions he's spending on this, 7 billion? I don't know what he's spending on this. Is next to parts of Mexico, which are particularly at risk of desertification, the water tables will sink. El Paso, Texas, for instance. I went there to talk to them over the summer. They're absolutely crazed about this because the notion is that you could shut out desertification is a fantasy. So that's the issue about this. For us, there is, I want to show you this. One of the things about, this is something I thought you might like to see. When you have an issue, an issue of migration like this, any kind of migrant crisis due to weather, you have a kind of diaspora that sticks. So this is what happened after Katrina. You can see that there is a concentration sort of around the city, but it's a 100-mile radius. But look at how much gets dispersed. And that was, after all, supposedly New Orleans recovered somewhat from it. So it's, This is an issue for us because we're having to rewrite, and something I'm involved in now, that the refugee law of 1951, which treats the difference between a migrant and a refugee, is that a refugee has a well-grounded fear of jeopardy if he or she goes back to the place that they came from. And we have very few resources for refugees, but we have some. But climate migrants under this law do not qualify for them. That is, they're not in any political jeopardy if they go home. They simply will die. They'll die of thirst, just the way many of these people couldn't go home because they couldn't rebuild their houses. So for us, what we are trying to do, and I think we will succeed, is to rewrite this 1951 law so that we erase the distinction between involuntary migration and refugee status. And that's probably not very compelling to you, but to us it's compelling because it unlocks some money. But anyhow, this is what this issue of desertification looks like. Now I want to say something to you about this issue, which is whether climate change can be addressed democratically. And by democratically, I mean in cities from bottom up through communities. And there are two issues about this. One is a question of time, and the other is a question of scale. The question of time is this. Most urban communal development takes time. It takes 2 or 3 years to organize a community so that people who have never cooperated with each other are able to work together. And in my very cheap book on cooperation, it's a wonderfully produced book by Yale University Press, you can see actually some case studies of what it takes to work from the bottom up to organize communities around new issues. It takes time, and the problem with climate change is that we don't have much time. In big cities like New York, to mobilize local communities to deal with climate change, my estimate is take about 25 years, and by that time it's too late. And that's because of the vagaries of local community boards and so on in New York. The other is a question of scale, that when communities organize bottom up, that they tend to be not idiosyncratic, but arrive at different kinds of projects they want to deal with. So the question of climate change, one community might decide to regulate driving, and another community might try to regulate water use. This isn't such a... Oh, I can move all of that. That's fun.
There's some.
So you get what are called asymmetric effects. And when you're losing water or you need to regulate energy, you simply can't have asymmetric low-scale effects. So this is a real issue for us, particularly in places where we're trying to get, like China, where we're trying to get people to use less energy. That the Chinese do have bottom-up forms of organization, despite what you read in the paper. In some ways, they're more democratic than India, which, anyhow, I don't go into that. But the coordination issues and the question of time mean that the practice of addressing it democratically is problematic. Now I'm going to talk to you about something that gets back to what I hope is more interesting to you. which is because it's more about material culture. And that is a relation between mitigation and adaptation. And I flipped out some things from here about New York City that will show you what these two differences mean. After Hurricane Sandy, there was a lot of talk in New York about what to do to deal with storm surge. And there were two major proposals about making berms. A berm is a piled up rubble, which is like a wall, but either under water or over water. It's this proposal by Bjarke Ingels is to create a berm in Lower Manhattan of a wall that would be 18 feet high, a berm that would be 18 feet high, to break the brunt of storm surge on Manhattan, addressing exactly the problems of actually Hurricane Sennett is his Bjarke is somewhat misleading because Hurricane Sandy actually came in. It came in, if you look from the south, from the lower right up, the storm surge really came up the right, and its hit was really 14th Street, and from 14th Street to that hospital, NYU hospital at 37th. Well, there was a storm surge here, but anyhow. So the idea about this is that he put up this huge berm to break the to break the power of a hurricane like this. And I show it to you because it's an extreme example of trying to build your way out of climate change. This is my team working at MIT, which tries to work with Bjarke's thing was, this is mitigation, and it's an extreme form of mitigation to build your way out of climate change. My team dealt with berms as a way of adapting to climate change. And rather than put berms on land in Manhattan, it puts them underwater on the liners of both the East River and the Hudson with underground plantings to slow down the every time you have a surge, there's an equal amount of energy, and in some cases more of it, with the retraction of the surge. This and then the sucking back into the sea is actually there's more energy in that. So our notion was that let Manhattan be hit, but then let the sucking motion be adapted to by these plantings so that the surrounding area is not destroyed. Staten Island, and so on. They're not actually difference in kind, they're difference in ideology. The notion of the MIT proposal was that you build in a way, you work with a problem, you don't try and build your way out of it. And it's an extreme because it allows Manhattan to be hit. It adapts to the surge and tries to deal only with the sucking part of it. And these are two very extremes of mitigation on one of the hand and adaptation on another. Let me show you how this interacts with what I was talking before about scale. This is the greatest storm surge barrier in the world, engineering-wise. It's the storm surge barrier in Rotterdam. I'll show you how it works. When there's a stir, the barriers are about 70 feet tall, and they just close on those pivots. It's a fantastic piece of engineering. And they pivot even a wind of 135 miles an hour, which is a category blue, I don't know what you call it in the States. It's a category blue hurricane. They still operate. The problem is it took 45 years to build this. So it's no model for us. You know, we have, according to my estimate, we have 19 years. So the idea that New York City or any other city could emulate this phenomenal piece of engineering to mitigate climate change, it's unrealistic in terms of time. Oh, this is out of scale. I'm so sorry. Here's something closer to home for you, is if we're going to green up Phoenix in order to cool the surfaces which are now heat-absorbing tarmac, you do these plantings, but these plantings wouldn't exist in this form for 30 years. So you've got the same problem. You have a solution. This is a real solution, but it's too late. So what are other ways of, I'm really sorry about this slide that's out of place. So what, I'll come back to it, are other solutions that are smaller in scale that are mitigating? I'm very interested in something called, and I'm just buying a lot of it, called Cool Seal, which is a goo, which is a water-based titanium-infused thing to paint the streets of, which are dark tarmac, white. You all know this from going to Greece. The reason those houses are white is that the white render, the white painted plaster, repels heat. And this is the same principle based on doing the same thing for streets. In New York City, one of the reasons it's so hot is that all the streets are dark like this, you know. So and that's true in Mumbai, it's true in Johannesburg. It was a nightmare. It's huge swathes of heat absorbing, and tarmac has a capacity to hold heat for a long time. So we're spending a lot of money on this goo, and if only I could invest in this Cool Seal company, I would gladly do it because it's great. Here's it. This is in the Bronx what you should be doing generally in New York City, which is to put Cool Seal on every single roof in the city. And your mayor, well, is not convinced of this. Can I leave it at that? But that would cool down New York City significantly. Let me show you something from LA that is really, to me, really interesting. This is a porous version of Cool Seal. The polymers in this are slightly different than the polymers in this. See, this is so easy to spread. Anybody could do it. It's part of the Green New Deal, you know. You make a lot of work for construction, spreading this. Same thing here. This I'm really interested in. It's a slightly different polymer version, but it's combined with a bioswale. That is a planting of certain kinds of grasses that retain and filter water, rain water, so that it's more potable than brown. And LA, under its wonderful mayor, is beginning to plant these all over. The grasses are, I've forgotten the Latin name of it, but they are a grass that you could put in your backyard. you know? Anybody could put their temperate, they go from zone 7 to zone 3, which is most of the temperate, it's most of the US. So we're going to replicate this in as many places as we can. This combination of these bioswales, which are basically these grasses set in a kind of sort of polymer base, and they just hold water, and the water is purified, and it goes into there's a pipe there, and it's reusable. So that is mitigation of a different sort than this heroic mitigation of the kind that is proposed for New York City or that works in Amsterdam. I'll show an example of adaptation that the Dutch have also done, which I'm terribly interested in, and that is floating houses. This is we're going to put money into doing this in Bangladesh. This is a very simple house built on pontoons. So when you've got flooding, the house just rises up. The Dutch being the Dutch, it's also got a huge water filtering system, and the whole thing is there's a Rem Koolhaas design, by the way, so you can see the famous Rem Koolhaas windows, the bar windows, all of that. But it's a brilliant idea, and that is again modest adaptation. Now, in line with that, I want to show something else we're doing, which is vertical resurfacing. Basically, we're taking here our clues from terraces in Singapore. I don't know if any of you have been there, but they're all over in Singapore. And we're quite interested in the Oasis Hotel in Singapore. It's 18 stories high, and the roof goes all the way up with these green plants, which are a species of non-intrusive ivy. And you can see the difference between this climate horror on the left side and the Oasis Hotel on the right side. Oasis Hotel it's cooler. It's not a sealed glass box, It can use, it's something that we want to do more and more of this. And that is research. Do you do anything about landscaping here? Plants? Is that part of what you consider crafts?
One could.
You could, because there's an aesthetic issue to this as well. How to make these look beautiful and cheap. This is what I hope all of the urban landscape could look like. Now, in New York City, probably won't happen, but other places in the States certainly could do this. Anywhere where there's an extensive use of concrete for cladding. Now, so the last thing I want to talk to you about is cultural change. And I'm sorry I've talked so long about this. I could go on endlessly. But the first thing I want to talk to you about is behavioral change. People always ask me, well, what can I do as an individual? And the two things you can do as an individual is become a vegan, and you can stop driving. A vegan because anything cow-based, cows fart and shit methane, and goats to a somewhat lesser degree, although for some reason they're smellier. But it's a really big deal. All beef-based consumption is methane producing. Chickens also, I've learned, are somewhat sinners in this regard. So that's for Puritans. I happen to love meat, and I eat it. We all have to sin somehow, and that's my sin. I want to just say something about, for us, the problem about driving. In a place like New York City, you can take public transport almost everywhere. And in a place like Copenhagen, you can use bicycles almost everywhere. If you were in Mexico City or in Mumbai, this is a very cruel prescription because the informal settlements where most people live are 2, sometimes 3 hours away by automobile from where the work is, which is in primary production plants. To advocate that somebody should take a bike to pedal from one of these settlements to their work means, it's so a lot of this kind of pedestrianization stuff is really the recommendation of privilege, and we're staying away from that. Our notion, which is equally difficult, but it gets away from that, is how to break down these primary production plants so that you can bring them closer to where people live. And that's an economic problem, not a transport problem. But I have to say I'm sort of driven crazy by this whole pedestrianization thing in cities, because it really requires an urban environment where of the privileged of riches. So, okay. Apart from that, you see the line at the top. That's where things really make a difference. I think it's at 2.34 degrees. I can't quite read what Jessica put in there. But below that are things that make something of a difference. Changes in food, air conditioning makes a big difference. It's a guzzler. But they are below actually making a huge difference in climate change. I want to just show you what the changes in food thing would look like. This is our calculation of a sustainable diet for climate change, contrasted, to the weekly ration that Brits like my parents endured in 1940. And you can just see this is a minimum weekly ration in 1940. It's full of all sorts of things which are climate no-nos. Whereas this is something that is, you could eat this. You understand you're eating mostly vegetables. You're having very little. 100 grams of cheese is nothing. You are eating a Mediterranean diet, basically, with maybe 2 sausages a week. So that's the level at which personal behavior change would make something of a difference, but it still wouldn't make anything like the difference of limiting your family size or of no longer driving. So that has inspired in me, and this is the last thing I want to talk to you about, is a problem of, even so, what lies over this whole climate change issue is the problem of people doing less. In Western culture, the notion of the uses of nature was that nature was a cornucopia that people could exploit in order to grow. That's a basic notion of what William Leese has called the domination of nature, which began in the 17th century. That nature was an inexhaustible source of resources for development, making of things, in farming, in the creation of energy through burning forests, all of that. And that was basically a notion in which the kind of articulation of civilization and was based on more, ever more, that would come from the cornucopia of nature. Today we're in a very different cultural situation in which we can no longer treat nature as nurturing in that same way. It's not a cornucopia. We can't keep milking it. And that's a whole different, I would suggest, a whole different notion about what culture is about. Wearing a political economy hat, I'd say that the problem that we're now facing is one rather than of growth, of redistribution of what we have, you know? And that's true economically about, you know, in general. We need to stop growing fortunes. And in the same way, we need to stop growing by virtue of exploiting the natural world, and instead think about redistributing what already exists. But it's a huge cultural shift. When I've shown this diet, for instance, to people in, I did this 6 months ago to people in Japan, they said, well, this is an outrageous proposition, even though they do eat better, more ecologically than we do. It just shows that you want to close the door so that we can't develop. And that's a very fundamental thing. The notion that we've exported the idea of the cornucopia as a kind of global notion of justice. And it's really it's literally unsustainable anymore, but it requires a culture change that I think is very, very profound in the sense of using material things, reusing them. I mean, this is again a problem for us in terms of a practical issue like waste. You know, we have a little group dealing with thrown out computers. Might not seem to you like a big issue, but it's a huge problem of waste. Most of these computers are absolutely fine. But to make new computers in order to keep Apple and all in life, there are lots of rare earths that are being consumed which can't be unconsumed or recycled. So there are lots of dimensions about this, about thinking about culture as no longer based on the cornucopia. And as I've said before, we don't have much time to do that. So, but this is the most abstract or culture, I guess, culture specific. It's the most philosophical problem that we're dealing with. But I think ultimately everything I've showed you before founders unless we get into a mentality which no longer has that relation between nature and culture. So that's, as I say, I have no solutions, magic bullets to propose to you, but tell me what you think and what we should be doing, and God knows whether we will, but I'd be very curious to hear your reactions. So how do you want to do this? Just to ask me.
Questions.
Yeah.
Yes.
I could
Yeah. Could you speak a little bit more about states of denial and how you get over cognitive dissonance?
Well, one thing about that has struck me about that, we're doing a little research group on that, as a matter of fact, tomorrow, is what happens for soldiers who are sent into battle where the likelihood is that it's not, they're not going to succeed. How does a military group, what binds it together, even in the face of probable loss? That was a problem in Britain from my parents during the battle for Britain in 1940. Most people expected the Germans were going to, land by 1941. The air war would be lost, and so on. And yet they kept fighting. Brits. So there are some ways to acknowledge the gravity of something that have to do with bonding with other people. The notion that, success or failure is not as important as obligation to others and cooperation with them. That makes soldiers able to do this. And that's sort of what we're going to try and think through tomorrow, is how we could pursue this in terms of organizing climate change groups. I'm all for Extinction Rebellion. I think they're a super group, but I think they're counterproductive in the notion of scaring people. So.
Which is their intention.
Yeah, to me, it's very, dealing with this on the ground, it's very counterproductive. You get the states. So I'm sort of interested in what we might come up with this. And they're very, very receptive to that, at least the American Extinction Rebellion, kids particularly. But, right now I think that this is the wrong rhetoric. And there has to be a different way of organizing.
Yeah, thank you. It's sobering. And, we too often sit in this room and listen to people talking about things that seem kind of at least somewhat irrelevant compared to the issues that you brought up this evening. I think one problem that a lot of us have is thinking, well, I already do X, Y, and Z, and, the political dimension would be to somehow incentivize people to do a small amount, because people think, well, if I do a little bit, it's not going to make a difference. So how can I, sending a message that even a little bit does make a difference, and to sort of publicize all of these statistics and the data that if you use one less plastic cup or take one less taxi or one less flight, as that says, but to somehow really get that message across, because I do think most people think, well, okay, one person, what can I do?
Yeah. Well,
and that's part of the denial.
Yeah, it is part of it. I wouldn't say it's denial. It's just something that when you get into this, you're faced with an overwhelming problem. It is denial, but it's, what can I do personally? I say this to you personally, not, in terms of my job. The best thing you could do is vote for the Green Party. Any candidate who signs up to the Green New Deal is your candidate. And that means Bernie Sanders. Now, I'm just saying this is my own view of this. A more sober, if he's not the Democratic candidate, I'd vote Green. That's the best thing that could happen. And as I say, it's just my own view. But the politics of this are that you have, for most politicians, you have lip service to this climate emergency and nothing happens. I think with him, he's really serious about this. So is that wonderful woman who invented the Green New Deal.
Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
AOL.
She's the real thing. That's.
She's unfortunately not running for president.
Well, get her to. The thing about this is that I'll tell you a story about this from the UN. We had a huge effort to organize climate change, to put countries on record that they do something about climate change in September. And we had 63 nations sign up to climate emergency. Gone on record that, and for most of those nations, this was just a way of kicking things into the long grass. They appointed commissions to study, what could be done. We don't need any more studies about that, But that's the problem with this. So I'm sure, you have these centrist politicians that will say, oh, yes, terrible problem, isn't it? And we must put it on the agenda. That's a state of denial. So I don't know, I'm just saying this personally. We were disgusted at the end of this week we have 63 nations signed up to declaring states of emergency, and nothing is happening. So,
but what we were beginning to show is that small, not like recycling, but things like building, the Oasis building, there are communities that are doing
yeah, there are things you
stuff,
can
and that
do.
always gives me hope. And when I was organizing in the old days, what you said, the negative, did not work. People shut down would say that's the way things are, and they'll always be that way. But if you gave them models of hope and of way things can change, there was at least something to hold on to, as a possibility. You need to be able to vision, to sort of see in your mind what it could look like.
Yeah.
And those things help you do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think in the cities where we're working, the wedge to get into this has to do with water rather than energy use, because water is something that people it's like even Rio. Most of the water is undrinkable and so on. So we've been, and it's a material that people can identify with. So we're sort of concentrating on that. They're still polluted. It doesn't do anything about air pollution. But I found that it's an issue that people can relate to. And since they have to do water rationing anyhow in most of these cities, the idea is that somehow they could do it better. And but there is no one magic bullet about this.
Who's the person actually?
I have a question actually about something, because you say that we will see these changes in about 16 or 20 years more, and most of us will be like in our 40s or 50s, and we expect that things don't get too worse from then to when we die, and I think that things will get very,
They will.
Worse in every sense. So it's what I hear everywhere is that we're trying to make things to, adapt or mitigate those changes, but never to stop or delay them. We know that at some point we will get to that point, but it's different to say that we will get to that point from 16 years from now, like in 2035, and saying that we will get to that in a century from now. When in that century we can make more changes and do it more eventually, when we can make a cultural change that will actually change everything.
Right.
So I don't know what's your perspective, if you're working with that, or if it's just something that we assume that we are going to cause, and how can we help the most people that we can help eventually?
Well, I'm in a state of denial about the fact that I just feel you've got to do what you do. There are some people like Bruno Latour, theorists, who think that we'll just go as a species. He thinks that's fine. The eye will readjust itself. So, I just don't like to think like that. And, but that's also, I'm 76, you're 26? 25, okay. So, this is your issue, not mine. I think it's, again, talking about a cultural thing, another aspect of it would be, what would it be like, for instance, to live at night in New York? Because you couldn't inhabit the city, you couldn't go outside. That's, maybe that's an issue you'll face in 25 years. That, humanity will become night dwellers as one kind of adaptation. What I don't think people can adapt to is desertification. And that's, as a practical matter, means that places like Los Angeles, Denver, probably Mexico City will have to be abandoned as places, because that's an irreparable problem.
Yeah, the problem that I see, for example, with desertification, most of the time because of extraction, like irregular or abusive extraction of water in some place. So we are seeing this problem in cities that had always had this problem, or places that had always had this problem, but we are starting to see these problems also in places that are supposed to have it.
Right, exactly.
So it's like we now have 10 cities, for example, in the world, but in 5 years we will have 50.
Yeah.
And in 10 years we will have 100. And what we will do, we will go underground, like because we will be able to.
It won't get you more water, but that's anyhow. Yeah. What were we going to say?
I'm just a little bit shocked to the extent that I don't hear any discussion about population. And I wondered if in your studies, for instance, you have looked at how fast the population of the world could be reduced, what would be the economic consequences of that, and how would that affect the ability of a declining population to exist in a different distribution over the face of the earth with a smaller population.
Okay, I have to answer you personally about that. I can't answer you institutionally about it.
Are there any studies institutionally?
Yeah, there are.
There are.
There are lots of, when I said that, one serious thing that could be done is only to have 2 children. Remember that?
Absolutely.
The reason I can't answer you institutionally about that is that anything that has to do with control of population is, because of the Catholic Church, a no-no for the UN. So we aren't getting into that. So I'm just telling you personally what I think about it. The thing that is most frightening to me about this is that in the places which are desertifying, both in Southeast Asia and the Sahel, in the Sahara, are also the places in which the rates of child fertility are the greatest. Where you have 5, 6, 7 children produced, in places where there's the least water. So that's, again, it's a north-south divide, that in the so-called global north, the fertility rate's much reduced. But I'm sorry to say that this is a problem we are unable, it'll have to be dealt with by another institution.
But it's such a missing gap in the discussion.
Yeah, it is.
I mean, I grew up as a kid, there were 2 billion people in the world. There are almost 8 billion people in the world today.
7.9.
And your age. So it's that's
No, I'm with you on
New
that.
York is the same size as it was when I was a kid.
Yes, although the New York region
The greater, yeah.
is much bigger. But that's a real problem for us. And I don't know whether we'll ever be, and it's a problem for, by the way, it's a problem in the United States too, since you have a president who, well, I don't go there, but you know what I'm saying. So it's, but you're absolutely right. You know, and it's.
Right, I'd like to
I just
see.
want to urge people to ask only one question so as to leave time for others to ask. There'll be time after to pin the speaker against the wall. I don't know if there's questions there. One in the back.
Hi, I was happy to hear you mention the word vegan. I'm a physician, and there's a huge link between diet, same prescription for the person, same prescription for the planet, which is a whole food plant-based diet. I'm so curious if there's any links being made in the UN or other places about the disease burden, the global disease burden, our food, our chronic disease, the economics of it. I mean, to me, it's just simple. Maybe it's naively simple, but a whole food plant-based diet saves the person, saves the planet, and reduces all the other junk that comes with it. So I'm curious how seriously that's really taken.
Well, we're taking it seriously because we're working with WHO, World Health Organization, who take it very seriously. And I have to confess to a great, I mean, I would like to become a vegan. Unfortunately, I'm addicted to meat. But I can see how easy it would be to be unaddicted if you were younger.
Try it for 2 weeks. I worked for in medical school.
Really?
Which was,
It's also a position of privilege, though.
What's that?
It's super privilege. Not everybody can have a diet without meat in different places in the world.
Well-
Not everybody health-wise can have a diet without meat.
I wouldn't say that, at least from what I know
I
about
can't.
this from my colleagues in WHO, that's not the case. That actually there are lots of plant-based foods which are no longer being grown, which are, for instance, the ubiquity of rice growing in the central parts of India has led to a lot of diminishment of biodiversity in the crops that they grew. Same thing is true in South America, that the decrease in biodiversity is also a decrease in what we're eating, I'm very curious about this. I'll give you some steers to what the people in WHO are doing.
I would be very interested because there's a clear connection in the medical world with this. Our chronic disease burden, most people don't know, but the big ones, cancer, diabetes, heart disease, reversible and preventable with a whole food plant-based diet. And we have a huge, yes, the science is there. So it's hard. We also, there's a lot of psychological research about, it's very hard for us to see our future selves. That's why it's hard for us to make decisions going forward. We know this about investing, right? Hard to save money because it's hard to see ourselves 30, 40 years in the future. So it's that same piece where I'm trying to educate patients all day long when I speak about, setting yourself up for your future self. And I give people the challenge, try it for a week, try it for 2 weeks, see how you feel. And usually it goes in the right direction. It sounds so simple, and I used to think this was radical. This wasn't taught to me in medical school. This was sort of a process and sort of keeping up with the science. But it seems crystal clear that if there was a cohesive focus on that, it would solve a lot of problems.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Well, one thing we are going to do is try and get better quantification of just which foods are the most polluting.
Polluting, did you say?
Yeah.
Well, there's another, this is a fine point, but there's a whole plant-based movement now with a lot of processed food, which is not what we're talking about because there's a burden on that. That's not the good idea. It's basically, fruits, vegetables, beans, and nuts. If that's the mainstay of it, it's cheap, it's healthy, it prevents disease in the future, and it's soft on the planet. And if that's the mainstay of what we're eating, it's, opens the doors for so many possibilities. I see that. I mean, it's certainly my filter because I come from the health aspect of it.
Yeah.
But it seems like a connection that everybody should be making.
Richard, it seems to me, nobody could fault you for not being apocalyptic in the presentation.
No, it's not apocalyptic, it's just critical.
But you did skate over the democratic question.
Yeah.
And really if you think about the challenges that we'll be facing in the planet for the next 25 years, and look at the current state of democratic institutions in the countries around the world that have democracies. And you made the point about the very poor reaction to the arrival of 1 million refugees in Europe a few years ago. So what are the possibilities for actually doing anything given the current state of democratic institutions? And then are you suggesting that the advent of, or the regression to less democratic forms of government around the world may offer more opportunities for doing something about these problems?
Yes. My own view on this, not my view of my colleagues, but my own view on this is that most practices of mitigation have to be autocratic. They have to be imposed top-down. And most activities of adaptation have to be democratic. They have to be developed bottom-up. There is, I just think the idea of consensual politics is a no-no, given the time frame we're in. And I'd be very happy for a Platonic dictator to say, you can't eat any meat anymore. Maybe that's how I get it, rather than trying it out for 2 weeks. It's just somebody to say it's not for sale. You can only get it on the black market, But seriously, I think that that's where this is going to play itself out in reality. That adaptive behavior and adaptive practices are something that we can do democratically. But there is no way that you simply need a kind of imposition from the top of rules about mitigation. And that's true particularly in places. It's why I'm very skeptical about climate markets. You know what I mean? Where you sell a climate market. This is something developed by Bob Stern and Lord Stern in Britain. It's called climate trading. And say you're China and you're emitting all this stuff, and you buy the climate rights of Somalia. This is wrong. That is an adaptive strategy economically. I don't think we should allow any more coal plants to be built. Period. That's tyrannical. It interferes with the market. Which to me is all typical. So, the twist that Obama got into about this. By the way, Obama is no hero to us. He failed to sign up to climate accords, so we really needed the U.S. to be solidly there for us, and it's nowhere. But he believed that you could really create a kind of capitalist system which would diminish, you could create incentives within capitalist system which would effectively deal with climate change and do good for the developing world. This is foolish. And it's not going to happen. So that's where I'm at personally on this. I would like to see a kind of much more tyrannical forms of control about mitigation.
Other questions?
Ask me one more question.
Well, you actually asked my very question, because on the one hand, Richard, you show ambivalence to democracy. You show ambivalence to revolution, the Extinction Rebellion way, which, I have a lot of respect for Extinction Rebellion. I think they romanticize
non-violent cooperation, as though that's going to solve anything. They have a very romantic story about that, that's how the colonialists were kicked out of India. I mean, it's part of the story, but it's clearly not the whole story. So they do, but if we don't have democracy, we don't have revolution, we do have the benign dictator model, right? But interesting, so it seems to be that the UN here is now kind of in this, you're kind of proposing the we of the UN as that kind of benign dictator place where that might happen. I'm just running with the metaphor here, saying what would that benign dictator be? I'm not really saying that the UN is going to take the role, but what could it be, right? Because this has to be, if it's not democracy, if it's not revolution. But interestingly, you were very quick to deny that it was an apocalyptic vision. But what happens when we start talking about the benign dictator, we feed into the American vision of apocalypse of being the one world order. And so you're going to have even greater denial from the very people we're trying to say, let's change. Because they already have a narrative of a one world order is the apocalypse, right? So I actually think there's a really interesting way to actually start investigating narratives of the apocalypse, that maybe we can think of something different. What would this benign dictator, global dictator be? What could it be if democracy isn't working, revolution isn't working? While also recognizing these narratives already exist as apocalyptic narratives, right? So I'm with Bruno Latour, to be honest. I think we're fucked, and that's it. I actually don't see there to be a solution, but I'm really interested to hear what your dictatorial, tyrannical model might be.
Well, I'll tell you, it's not quite so high-flown as what you're talking about. I'm interested in the ways, because I'm dealing with cities and climate change, in which cities impose laws about use. And this is not at the level you're talking about. But I think there has to be a governance model in cities which is prescriptive rather than adaptive. And I don't know whether the word dictator is right, but there have to be draconian measures.
I absolutely agree, but how does that differ from this democracy doing this? How does that differ if it's just city-based?
What do you mean just city-based?
Well, so your ambivalence about democracy, that this country does this or they're going to regulate this, but that country might be doing something else, and actually we need to act on the level of scale. So if those draconian measures are only city-based, right, prescribed by city by city by city.
If I may say so, I think that you're being carried away by your own rhetoric. The issue about this is what people in the next 14 or 15 years can do. And I think that they can do something at the level of cities to diminish, but certainly not to solve the kinds of problems that I've articulated here. And there are lots of things at the urban level that can be imposed. Maybe we'll die out as a species. I don't know. It'll happen after I'm dead. So, but I think again, it's a question of trying to get a handle around something which is serious, which you are resolved to deal with, rather than and this is, to me, dealing at the scale of what cities can do is a way of dealing with something. It's not a solution that's global. I think when you start this is just my own view, you do yourself a kind of mental imagery by inserting things like, imperialism or American hegemony. Then it's all impossible. Then just let it fall apart. There has to be some way in which you can frame a problem in a way which you don't fall into. That's a state of denial too. You're frozen in the headlights. I'm sorry to say this, so.
No, I have, yeah, I mean, I don't want to, I've taken my time. I actually, I'm the first one to make changes, but I actually also.
There's a way in which, I mean, the rhetoric of the crisis is it really matters in terms of your own agency. And so that's, anyhow, that's why we're focusing on cities rather than nation states, because it's more agency for us.
We are, as a collective, but not yet as a species, out of time. Professor Sennett will be around. There's refreshments outside. Please feel free to continue informally. But first, we have to thank our speaker for a very serious and sober and thoughtful and engaging and provocative presentation. Thank you.